Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're at and what time you're watching this. But more importantly, thanks for joining us. It is August 8th, 2023, and we have the opportunity to be joined by a talented group of colleagues. And so on and joining us, particularly in our University of Minnesota Sheep and Goat team, is myself and Miss Brenda Miller. And a couple of the colleagues that we have is that we're going to allow them the opportunity to give and share their knowledge, but Dr. Emily Barrell and also Dr. Whitney Knauer. And so Dr. Barrell grew up in Colorado. A large part of her professional and veterinarian degrees came from Colorado State University. I, too, share the alumni of being a CSU Ram, and she's been at the University of Minnesota since January 2018. We just talked, and in fact, Dr. Knauer joins us, grew up in Pennsylvania, went to the University of Vermont, University of Pennsylvania as well again, and then has joined and certainly helped on some of her degrees at the University of Minnesota. The reason that I wanted and our team wanted to these talented young ladies to join us is because I apologize. I get super excited. You ladies know that, okay? So I'm not very good at keeping that under control. But these talented ladies are the ones that help to facilitate small ruminant medicine for the University of Minnesota with our College of Veterinary Medicine. And so they're the talented people that I call on, because certainly the repro people don't know nutrition as much as they want. The nutrition people don't know veterinary as much as they want. So we try to make sure that we can evaluate the whole system, no doubt. But of course, on these particular webinars, we have the opportunity to provide the expertise. So thanks for everyone that's joined us from all across America and all across the globe. And we're going to pass the baton. Ladies, the floor is yours. We appreciate you joining us.
Great.
Thank you.
I will share my screen and we will get going. So, does that look okay? Yes. Great. Can someone confirm that they can see that? Travis, Dr. Barrell?
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that intro, Travis. We're excited to spend the next hour and a half with you all, and hopefully we'll get some good time to answer some questions as we go through. But this is a great time of year to start talking about preparing for the breeding season. We're just at the very beginning when animals are going to start cycling. So we're excited to share some of these things with you today. And certainly we're going to take more of a health based approach today. Also talking about some management things, but really looking at it through a health lens. So, So Travis did a great job of introducing us, but I just wanted to reiterate that Dr. Barrell and myself are the sort of small ruminant team at the College of Vet Med. And so we have the honor, I guess, of teaching small ruminant production medicine, herd health, to our veterinary students. And so we have somewhere between 25 and 30 students every year who go through our selective coursework and then our rotation. So we're working really hard to get veterinarians up to speed with small ruminant things. And you can see there, we're both holding goats with goats in the background, although we don't really have any partiality to one or the other, sheep or goats. So today, what we're going to be talking about are these four things. So we're going to go through sort of ensuring health in your ewes, does, rams, and bucks. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the breeding soundness exam. So that's a really important part, or really important thing to think about when we're thinking about preparing for breeding. Talk a little bit about biosecurity. So this is a great time of year for people to be bringing animals onto the farm, might be bringing rams or bucks, might be bringing new breeding animals. And then Dr. Barrell is going to talk about hoof trimming principles, and she's going to do a live demo, which is, well, the animal with the foot. So we're excited for that. So, and this is T-Rex. He's one of our favorite bucks at one of the dairies that we work with. He's awesome. He's a California buck. All right. So when we're thinking about ensuring health in our ewes and does and our rams and bucks, There's kind of 4 things that we need to think about, and probably even more, but these are the 4 big ones. Thinking through monitoring proper nutrition. So we do that through body condition scoring. And then we'll talk a little just very briefly about flushing. Vaccination. So this is the time of year when we want to start thinking about our vaccination programs, particularly one vaccine. It's a also important time of year. We're getting to the time of year when parasite burden is going to be pretty high in our animals that have been out on pasture. And then thinking about culling. So those are the things that we're going to talk about as it relates to health. And what we really need to do when we think about on the ewe or the doe side is they need to be healthy enough to get pregnant, to maintain their pregnancy, to make good colostrum with antibodies. So that's thinking about the lamb or the kid, and then making milk for that lamb or kid, or making milk to sell if you're a goat dairy. And so the first thing to talk about when it relates to health and monitoring and nutrition is body condition scoring. And those of you who have heard either of us talk before, we definitely like to talk about body condition scoring. So this is where we're measuring kind of that subcutaneous fat and muscle underneath the skin of the animal. And that's going to give us an idea of kind of the general health and condition of that animal. And so how do we do this? We do this by looking at a specific part of the sheep or the goat, and that is that part sort of behind the ribs, but in front of the hips. So that part of the spine, and so that's what we call the lumbar spine. So again, that's kind of behind the last rib up to the hip of the animal. And that's this highlighted part here, this green part on this skeleton of a goat. And then that's kind of what's highlighted here in this picture in the top right. This is the area that we're going to be assessing in the animal. And what are we going to be assessing? So again, we're trying to understand kind of the subcutaneous fat and muscle deposition in that area. It's the loin of the animal. And what we're going to be doing is sort of feeling over the vertebra, that's a cross section of the animal here. Oopsie daisy. There we go. Cross section of the animal, and this is the spine. This is the vertebrae, and so on these vertebrae we have what we call dorsal spinous processes. So that's kind of what's coming off the top of the vertebrae, and then we have transverse processes, which are kind of coming off the side. And what we're doing is we're trying to assess kind of fat coverage over those, and then also what is sort of sitting between them. And so we'll be kind of feeling over the top side of the animal, and then along the side of the animal. And then sort of filling in between. And what we want, we'll get to the next slide, what the goal is, which is a sort of a body condition score of 3. And that's where kind of our hands between that transverse spinous process and that dorsal spinous process, where our hand is sort of flat. That's what we want. So that would be a perfect animal in perfect body condition. And that's where we kind of want our animals pretty much all the time. When our hands start to do this in that space, that's when we're putting more fat in that area, and that's when we're increasing our body condition. And then when our hands start to do this, so we have less deposition of fat in that area, that's when we get lower body condition. And so we measure this on a 5-point scale from and you can see here, these are again that cross section. And you can see this yellowish white area, that is the fat, or represents the fat. And you can see as we go from here, which is a body condition score of 1, to here, which is a body condition score of 5, and that's where they kind of have a rain gutter down their back, where they have sort of that fat dimple there. You can see that it's just more fat that is deposited in that area. And sometimes, especially with emaciated animals, we actually get muscle wasting. But the reality is what we want, particularly prior to breeding, are animals in a body condition score of 3. And that goes for bucks and rams, as well as our female population, our breeding population. What we really want to stay away from are animals that are emaciated, and those animals deserve intervention. And then unfortunately, a lot of animals, especially we see on smaller flocks and herds, we see animals that are more over-conditioned. And so that is also detrimental to reproductive performance. So really what we want is those animals in that 3 zone. And so a couple things about body condition. One is that body condition score, one body condition score is about 12% of body weight, and it takes about 6 weeks. And this is when we're talking about increasing body condition. If we have an under-conditioned animal, it takes about 6 weeks to increase a body condition score. So what that means is if we're at this time of year and say we want kids or lambs in February or March, we're going to be thinking about putting a buck or a ram in, here in the next month or so. We don't really have enough time probably to increase the body condition score. So if we have thin animals, we are probably already behind in kind of where we want to be with those animals. And so they're really 5 times a year. So we have pre-breeding here, which is this time of year. So, July, August. And then we have other times of year when we want a body condition score too. So at weaning, for sure, that's when we're going to be thinking about making culling decisions. Mid-pregnancy, and that's usually if we're doing reproductive ultrasound. That's a great way to put hands on animals. At lambing, and then 6 to 8 weeks post-lambing. And so again, what we're trying to do, this is actually a picture of a sick sheep, but thin animals. So we're trying to find those thin animals so that we hopefully can increase condition on them before we're going to try to breed them. This is just some data to show that so condition score at tupping, so that's the English term for putting the ram in or putting the buck in. And you can see here that we increase our lambing percentage if we are breeding at a higher body condition. So that's lambs born per 100 ewes and a body condition score of 2, or at a lambing percentage of maybe 150. But when we go up to 3, we're almost at 200%. So, 1.5 lambs per ewe versus almost 2 lambs per ewe. And that has some real economic benefits to it, right? The other thing I want to say about body condition scoring at this time of year, that's going to help us decide whether or not we might need to increase the plane of nutrition in our animals for a couple reasons. One is for flushing. So if we have animals that are in lower body condition, so less than a 3, so in that 2 range, adding that extra nutrition is actually going to be beneficial when it comes to flushing and increasing the nutrition in those animals to improve fertility. But with animals that are at a higher body condition score of 3, for example, that doesn't typically work, and we typically don't see improved reproductive performance. So just another thing to consider. And then this is a video. I'm sure you can all, hopefully you can all appreciate that this is a doe in heat. She's wagging her tail. She's paying attention to this buck here. And he's, being gross because he's a buck. But my point with this video is to say that body condition scoring is also really important in our males, in our rams and our bucks, because these guys, not necessarily in this situation, but for sure when we have animals out in a pasture that are breeding a group of ewes or a group of does, those animals might not eat. They're running around trying to breed everyone. And so making sure that they're in that good body condition before they go out is quite important for their health and welfare. So we can't forget about the boys, is my point. There he goes again. Okay, so that's what I want to say about body condition scoring. It's really important. Hopefully you're doing it in your herds and flocks, and hopefully you're recording it, keeping track. It's a really good way to monitor your nutrition. It's a really good way to monitor changes in your nutrition programs. So it's just a really valuable tool for producers. So moving on to vaccinations, I'm only going to talk about the Clostridial vaccine. So that is CD and T. So that protects against Clostridium perfringens type C and D and tetanus. And the reason to talk about this is because this is a good time of year. So males need to be vaccinated once per year. And typically we want to do that prior to turnout, particularly because we're probably going to be doing some other things for that buck, giving them a bit of a spa day before they are thrown out with the ewes or the does. And then, the other population to think about is the ewes and the does. And so this is sort of, I guess, premature because it's not really a pre-breeding thing, but it's something that you should start thinking about is vaccinating those animals when they are pregnant. And so typically we want to do that in the last 30 days or no more than 30 days prior to them kidding or lambing. So that they can pass those antibodies onto their lambs or kids. And so this is just an example of why that's important. So this is a graph from a study where they vaccinated animals, or they vaccinated the ewes, and then they looked to see what that did for the lambs and what kind of protection that gave those lambs. And in this case, so this red line, so these animals were vaccinated 3 weeks prior to lambing, and they had this big spike in antibody levels in their blood against that's protection against clostridial diseases, so overeating disease, pulpy kidney disease, and tetanus. And then what we see is those animals pass those antibodies on to those lambs in this study, and lasted 4, 5, 6 weeks post lambing. So again, not necessarily pre-breeding, but I always want to put this in folks' minds that CD&T is the vaccine that we really need to make sure that we're getting into our animals in appropriate timings. All right. Third thing when we're thinking about health is parasite control. So again, this is the time of year when animals are going to have the heaviest burden, or maybe even into September, depending on what kind of pastures these animals have been on over the summer. But for sure, parasite burden, whether it's homuncus or any of the gastrointestinal worms, are associated with lower body condition and all the downstream effects of that. So particularly important when thinking about pre-breeding, reduced reproductive performance, lower birth weight offspring. So nutrients are partitioned away from kids or lambs in order to make blood cells or repair parts of the intestine that are damaged by these worms. And then thinking about later, those animals are infected, then we need to think about an infection of lambs and kids once those animals are potentially put out on pasture. So this is the time of year. Typically, we're moving away from recommending blanket deworming. So that would be deworming every animal in the herd or every animal in the flock. But this is when we would want to pair body condition scoring with potentially FAMACHA scoring. So that's when we're looking at the conjunctiva of animals. And I can refer you, if you're interested, there's presentations that both Dr. Barrell and I have done that we can refer you to that really focuses on this parasite control piece. But it's just another thing to think about when we're considering getting animals ready for breeding. Oops, boy, my mouse is very touchy. Okay, the other thing to think about, the last thing when it relates to health, and this is something that can be hard, is culling decisions. And I also put on here, the decision not to breed, because just because you're not going to breed an animal doesn't mean you need to send them down the road. It depends on your goals as a producer. But really, this post-weaning, pre-breeding time is the time of year when we want to make those decisions. We've weaned the lambs off, we've weaned the kids off. This is a great time to think about how that animal performed last year, what that animal currently looks like, and then making those decisions. So typically, this is a great time to look at your records. Hopefully you have some production records where you're keeping track of, body condition scoring, keeping track of things like, health treatment of offspring, so lambs and kids, looking at, udder conformation, all these things. And then actually physically looking at the animal. So again, we want to use that combination of records of the animal and then looking at the animal to make that decision. Excuse me. And so that can include body condition scoring, milk production, palpating the udder. So this animal in particular, this is a goat. We palpate this udder and you can see it's very lumpy. And so this is an animal that if we were to, breed her again and she had kids, This is a dairy goat, but if it were a meat goat, that udder is probably not going to support the next batch of kids. So that would be an animal that we would not want to breed for that reason. And these are some ewes that have just lambed. But again, we would be looking at them. We would be looking at the lambs, looking at growth rates, for example, all these things to try to make those decisions. All right, so that's health. The next thing to talk about is the breeding soundness exam. And so we'll kind of walk through what this is and why it can be useful. So what this is when we're thinking about the male side. So we're trying to understand the potential of a male, and typically we're doing this in sheep, but we can do it in goats as well. How successful is that animal going to be reproductively? And so the important thing to remember is that anywhere between 10 and 30% of, this is ram, so this would be sheep, bucks and rams, so both sheep and goats, sheep and goat males, anywhere between 10 and 30% are, when they're evaluated, are shown to be unsuccessful or breeders that are not going to be able to get everyone pregnant. And so if you think about that, if you have a flock of 40 sheep, for example, and you use one ram, if that animal is in that 30%, you are going to have not a very great lamb crop the following year. So this is a good way to try to identify animals and that we're not really trying to find like the superstars, the superstar breeders. What we're really trying to find are the animals that aren't going to satisfactorily do the job. And so if you're using animals, the advantage here is that what we can do if we use animals that are satisfactory breeders is we can shorten our lambing or our kidding window. So I have producers where we've done breeding soundness exams and found some questionable characters and suggested that maybe they don't use them, where they've had 17-day lambing windows because everyone got pregnant on that first cycle. You can increase your ewe to ram ratio if you have a really good animal. You can, and depending on your management structure, you can potentially breed more animals per ram. Usually, if we have a good animal, we're going to have fewer open ewes and or does, and then often we'll also have a higher percentage lamb or kid crop. So the number of kids or lambs born per ewe or doe is going to be higher. And so lots of advantages. Here's one study, and this is from the economic standpoint of a lot of ewes, 2,800 ewes, that BSE increased profitability by $20 to $25 per ewe. So that's significant, significant dollars. And so what does this entail? And so this is something that your veterinarian can do. And really it consists of sort of three big things. The first is looking at the animal and asking the question, is this animal physically fit enough to breed? So what do the feet and legs look like? Can the animal see? Can the animal get around? Is the animal in good body condition? Then the next evaluation is an evaluation of the reproductive tract, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then semen evaluation, which again, I'll talk about in the next slide. And this is, usually we do this one time. So usually it's a snapshot in time. It's not a guarantee of fertility, but it's assessment of kind of likelihood. And what the outcome is, or the definition sort of a satisfactory ram is that 50 to 75 ewes or does will be serviced in the first cycle. So if you only have 40 ewes and you have a satisfactory animal, that can be pretty good. So going through that again. So again, the first thing that we do is we look at the animal. And this is a buck. And you can see that he's kind of hunched up, standing kind of with his left leg there kind of tucked underneath him. And so that would be something that we would note to say, okay, this animal, he's a Nubian, so he's probably he can breed pretty much anything, but potentially it will not physically be able to handle breeding large numbers of does. Another thing, so this is a little teaser buck, and he, the reason I have this picture here is because he was a teaser for some, so that's a Nigerian dwarf, and he was a teaser for some boar goats, and so it's just a size thing. So he's a little guy. So that's another thing we would want to look at, is usually little guys can get it done, but again, is he physically equipped to do the job? Can he see? Are his feet and legs good, etc. The next thing, so there's the overall of the animal, then we kind of hone in on the reproductive tract. So we'd usually do a scrotal circumference, so that like the circumference of the scrotum is directly correlated to ability to produce sperm. And so there are guidelines for satisfactory, unsatisfactory as it relates to how big that scrotum is. And then we also, along with measuring it, so this is one of our students, and now she's a practicing veterinarian, but when she was a student, palpating. So we palpate, we make sure that the testicles feel no lumps or bumps, that they can move freely in the scrotum, and we can palpate sort of all parts of the testicle to make sure that everything feels okay. Another thing that we do is we look at the penis itself, and so particularly with animals, as we get closer to breeding season, they can injure themselves, and so it becomes important to kind of look at the penis itself so that we can understand if we can do the job. And then we get a sample of semen. And so what we do then is we look at two different things. We look at the motility. So how is that sperm moving? Because it needs to move to get to where it needs to go. And then we also look at morphology. So we look to make sure that all of the sperm look normal. We've had animals before where we've done this, and he looks great. Everything looks great about him. But then when we get to looking at all of the sperm, he's just not satisfactory. And so those are kind of the pieces, all of the things that we look at to make that judgment as to whether or not he's going to be able to do the job. And so that's kind of the nuts and bolts. The next question is when. So breeding sauna should be performed in enough time prior to turning that animal out or using that animal as a breeding animal, so that if he is unsatisfactory, we can either give him time to heal or find another ram or buck. And so we want to make sure that we give enough time, but not too much time to that animal. And then we would retest them. So particularly with an injury, or sometimes with younger animals, they can be kind of borderline. Then we retest them, and sometimes they're fine. The other really important thing is that if an animal passes the BSE once, that doesn't mean that the following year they're going to be just as good. So typically we recommend doing this every year, particularly as animals age. They can wane. Young animals might have some challenge, and so we really want to do this every year. All right, so last topic, and then we'll get into foot trimming. So biosecurity. So again, this is the time of year when you might be considering bringing a new animal onto your property. And so just some things to think about as you make those decisions. So and I have this picture here because, a lot of people are bringing potential breeding animals onto their property. And so when we think about that is a risk. And so when we talk about biosecurity, that's really controlling the introduction and or spread of infectious disease in your herd and your flock. And again, new animals and new additions pose the biggest threat. And so things to think about. So, what diseases do you already have? What diseases are you willing to tolerate? And so, here's just a laundry list kind of the sort of the big important ones that I would maybe some annoying ones, or if I think is sometimes more annoying than anything else. But these are ones that you may have, or you really want to keep away from your herd or your flock. So particularly resistant worms. So this is a conjunctiva animal that has a very heavy worm burden. And these are some little kids with ORF. And so, you know, some other things, ringworm, that's sort of an annoyance, I think. But big ones, foot rot, infectious abortion, and then the big contagious diseases and infectious diseases, caseous lymphadenitis, OPP or CAE, and then Johne's disease. And so what are our options here? So some of you may have a closed herd or a closed flock, and that's one where really no new additions are added ever. And so the really, you know, genetic progress doesn't happen very well that way, unless we're using AI or ET or IVF or something like that, some advanced reproductive techniques. So there really aren't very many truly closed herds. So what we're more likely working with is a mostly closed herd or flock. And that's where there are minimal new additions. Usually we want to purchase animals kind of from known operations or places where the disease status is known. Sometimes that's really hard, but you can definitely, there are things that you can test for, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. You know, thinking about buying animals in lots instead of single animals. So particularly if you're you have the ability to quarantine, buying, you know, rather than bringing one animal per month, buying, you know, 12 animals in a lot, and then staying away from the sale barn. So some of you may have had success buying animals from the sale barn, but it does, you really don't know what you're getting when you buy animals at the sale barn. So it's a pretty big risk. And so these are kind of my big five, I guess, top diseases of concern. So OPP, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So that is in CAE. So it's kind of the sheep and goat version of the same infectious viral disease. Johne's disease, so that is a bacterial disease, a chronic bacterial disease. Caseous lymphadenitis, so that's where we get the external abscessation. Foot rot, and then resistant parasites. And so some things to consider, like, how do we know? How do we ensure that the new arrivals are free of these things? First one is testing. So we recommend for sure OPP and CAE testing for new arrivals. Johne's testing becomes a little more difficult, and CL is not as reliable when you get a positive or a negative. And so but those are some ways of evaluating the animal for those things. For foot rot, so foot rot is often bought in to an operation, and so that's where your trust in who you're buying animals from comes in. So understanding the seller, the flock or herd status, and then maybe treatment, and then resistant parasites. Typically, I mean, we can do all three. But typically what we're doing is sort of a combination testing and treatment. So that's where our quarantine becomes really important. Other things, obviously, if you're bringing animals in from out of state, they should, well, any animals, right? They should be free of visible signs of disease. So no snotty noses, no diarrhea. And then avoid adding vulnerable populations, particularly pregnant or young animals. And another thing to consider when you're bringing new animals onto your property are that new arrivals should be quarantined. And this is really, the 3 weeks is kind of a made up number, but it gives us enough time to do these four things that I have listed here. So it allows time for you to take those tests, or for your veterinarians to take those samples and submit them to the lab, and for you to get the results back. It allows time for a disease to manifest, particularly something like foot rot, which might be you know, stress-related, respiratory disease, stress-related, stress of transport that can help those diseases to emerge. It allows time, so again, with parasites, to perform a fecal egg count reduction test. So that's where we would take a sample, deworm the animal, and then retake that sample and compare to see to see if we were able to reduce the parasite burden in that animal. And then it allows time for spa treatment. And so Dr. Barrell will talk about foot trimming, but other things to consider during that time are, just general once over, body condition scoring. I guess those are the big ones, but it allows time for that as well. And so this is just an example. This is a producer who has this quarantine animal or quarantine area set up on their property. They also work with this group of animals last. So they work with everyone else, all of their other animals on the farm. And then they come here, and that's the last thing they do before they go inside, wash their boots and change clothes. I don't love that there is wood. So wood is not, it's very hard to sanitize wood, but they have this little calf hutch here. And this area is totally removed. Has no ability to interact with other animals. And so that's a really nice setup. And I think, yeah, that's my last slide. So now we are going to transition over to Dr. Barrell. And so we're just going to switch screen sharing. Yep.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you. So I'm the kind of last part of this lecture. I'm going to focus in on a piece of what Dr. Knauer mentioned already, which is hoof trimming. So hoof trimming is a year-round priority, but one of the most important times to go through the animals and check on everybody is pre-breeding. So this is a time when you're already going to be handling them for, this is like Dr. Knauer said, you're evaluating whether or not you want to breed them. We are doing our breeding soundness exams on the males. We're potentially sorting through our ewes and does. So I think this is a great time to refresh yourselves on trimming. So I know most of you that own small ruminants are doing this already. So I really just wanted to focus in on the basics, reiterate some of the anatomy. This is how we teach our veterinary students as well, just to kind of identify the best way to trim a foot in theory. And then I just have 2 slides. I wanted to just briefly touch on the 2 most common hoof diseases that we see, which would be foot rot and Whiteline disease. So basically, I want to just kind of talk through how I teach students how to go from this claw here on the left to this trimmed claw here. So the first question is why do we need to trim hooves? What, like they wear them down to some degree on their own. So why do we need to intervene? And so I think the most important point here is the last one, is it ensures that the animals can get to the food and water and to each other for breeding. So the foot is really one of the most important structural pieces of a small ruminant. And when we have foot pain or structural abnormalities, it can really limit everything from weight gain, wool production, all the way up to who gets pregnant, who maintains their pregnancy. So it's also an important means to prevent lameness and infection. So we'll talk about foot rot, improving appearance. So certainly, I know some of you show your sheep and goats. And so having a correctly shaped hoof is going to be critical for that. But again, most importantly, it's so that our animals can get around comfortably to either get pregnant or produce what you need them to produce. So when should we be doing hoof trimming? So the answer is it depends. And the frequency depends on your management at home and kind of your setup. So nutrition plays a huge role. Animals that are on really high planes of nutrition, who are receiving growing and showing rations, those that get large amounts of like a concentrate or a grain compared to those who are grazing or are strictly on forage, those animals are growing their hoof a lot faster than those other groups. Terrain also plays a role here. So, excuse me. So housing animals in like a nice deep packed bedded barn, for example. So maybe you have dairy does in a barn and they live on straw that's very soft, or animals that are in a lush pasture, that's very soft footing, and we don't have that friction to kind of wear those hooves down as aggressively as compared to maybe you think of the mountain goats, right? They're climbing on rocks all day. They never get their feet trimmed because they're doing it naturally. Same goes for, say, a sheep herd with potentially like a cement slab out front where they walk back and forth across that every day. They're going to wear their hooves down a lot faster than their counterparts. Climate, wet climate and kind of cooler temperatures typically favor hoof growth, where if we have, you know, dry, kind of desiccated climates like the Western United States or other parts of the world, those animals don't necessarily grow quite as quickly as in wet conditions. And then frequency also comes down to human factors like labor. This is a labor-intensive practice, so we do things to, you know, make it easier for ourselves, which we can talk about with restraint. But no matter what you do, hoof trimming is labor-intensive. So sometimes the frequency depends on what you can and can't do at home. I would say in an ideal situation, most small ruminants need to have their feet trimmed 2 to 3 times a year. At minimum, I would say bare minimum is once yearly. I think the more we can do it, the better to a degree. Over trimming can get us into trouble as well, but I think usually the problem we encounter is we just can't get it done often enough. And the animals that are at greatest risk of hoof disease are the ones that are overconditioned, or the chubby ones. So again, the more nutrition you have, the faster the hoof grows. And that's similar, like we've already reiterated, animals on high volumes of grain and animals on soft ground. So those ones are already predisposed to hoof disease, so we need to pay special attention to them. So just a reminder about, or an introduction to the anatomy of the hoof. So there's kind of 2 aspects to think about. So I'm going to talk about sort of the angles of the hoof when you're looking kind of at the outside, and then the bottom of the foot when you pick it up. So for example, here we've picked up a foot, the heel is back here, and then there'll be a heel bulb. This is typically pretty soft and grows more rapidly than the rest of the hoof. We have the hard wall here, and then the sole is kind of everything from the heel bulb forward. There oftentimes you can see, so the hoof wall in most large animal species, there's a sensitive and an insensitive layer of the hoof wall, and those 2 layers kind of fit together like your fingers interlocking, and where they meet, they actually can have a white line. It's not depicted in this image, but I'll show it shortly. So that's kind of what holds the wall to the foot and the underlying bone underneath. Here's a actual image of that. So from the side, kind of the side view, the 2 important angles that I really want you to think about are the coronary band. So this is an imaginary line where the hoof meets the hair. If we were to clip all the hair off of this little foot here, you would see that there's a nice distinct line. So if you can imagine dropping a straight line, this is the angle of that coronary band. And then this is the wall of the hoof. And I hope you can see this is the angle of it meeting the ground here. So if we pick that hoof up, we can see these structures that I just described. So these are the heels here. This is a well-trimmed hoof. I'm just going to move my little bar here. And what's important is this well-trimmed hoof is everything is flush and level. So the sheep and goat bear weight on the heel and the hoof wall. So we need all of this to be level in order for them to bear weight properly. Other things to note here, the sole here, the outer dark kind of grayish black is the wall. And then I hope you can see this white line, that's the black arrow here. Again, that's where the sensitive and insensitive tissues of the hoof wall come together to hold everything in place. So when we talk about equipment, everybody has their favorite pair or favorite type of hoof nipper. So this is definitely the most common way that we trim hooves and claws. I don't think it matters necessarily which type you use, but I can tell you after many years and thousands of feet being trimmed, sharp is what matters the most. So we here at the university try to be frugal. So for many years, I was shipping off our pairs of nippers to have them resharpened. And I think that worked to a point. But what we learned was it's hard to do a good job with dull nippers. It really is. So we invest in new equipment, new nippers, more frequently than we were doing in the past. And I think that's made a lot of difference in the quality of our trimming, as well as the teaching. The poor students, they don't always love to use the dull nippers when we're doing hoof trimming in January in Minnesota. So I have a picture of a nail grinder in here. So certainly this is basically a rotary disc with, it'll have some kind of a filing surface both on the flat edge and on the thin edge here. And so some people do prefer a grinder. It's completely up to you as to what you prefer. They're a little bit more expensive. They certainly are quick, and it's a nice way to get a nice flat surface on the sole, but just wanted to point that out. Other tips for success. So if you don't have a cradle, if you're a sheep producer or sheep owner and you don't have one of these chairs or hammocks or cradles, these are a lifesaver for you, the sheep, and your back, most importantly. Certainly we can tip sheep on their rump and hold them up and do their feet ourselves, but these are wonderful and actually not very expensive. So if you aren't using one of these guys, you should look into it. So most of the time our sheep will sit nicely. They can be adjusted. So smaller sheep, you can adjust it so it's more narrow and vice versa. And it allows you to kind of get things done on the feet that you need to at a height that's more appropriate. And then lastly, the most luxurious of all are some of these tilt tables. So these systems are this is actually a portable system. So it's got portable panels that lead to a head gate. And then this actually rotates. So when this sheep walked in, it was vertical, and then it squeezes, keeps her nice and secure, and she's able to be tilted on her side. So this is great for hoof trimming. It's also great for things like if we're doing a breeding soundness exam and we need to ejaculate a ram or a buck, this is the best and most secure way to do it on their side. It's good for examining the udder or treating any wounds. So this is definitely the top-notch system. So wanted to put a plug in for that. Okay, so how do I teach vet students to trim a foot? So I think the most important thing I think that gets forgotten when we're trimming feet is the natural angle of the hoof for sheep and goats. So sheep and goats, this is a almost perfectly trimmed foot here on the right. And what I would like you to notice is that the angle, if I were to draw an imaginary line, I hope you can see my pointer here. Knauer or someone, can you verify that you can see my pointer going back and forth?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So the angle of the coronary band, if we were to draw a line, would be something like this. And the angle of the hoof is quite similar. And so one of the most important concepts for vet students and new producers to understand is that in a sheep or goat, these lines should be parallel, actually, in a well-trimmed or a worn-down hoof. These angles, these lines should be parallel. The way that hooves grow, unfortunately, is that they grow a lot from the heel. So this on the left is an untrimmed hoof. So again, here's the angle of the coronary band. If we were to clip that hair, you would see a line right here. And what happens is as the heel grows forward, our line starts to diverge. So instead of being perpendicular, instead of being parallel to that coronary band, it becomes, it opens up here, we get an increased angle. And then what happens is the mechanics of this are all wrong. So now instead of having our weight bearing be pretty up and down, we start to develop more pressure on the heel back here. We can get some trauma to the heel bulbs. We can start to get separation of the hoof wall. So keeping that in mind when we're trimming feet is critical. So I have an example here. So this is a pretty overgrown hoof. So the angles, once again, that I'm talking about this is the coronary band. So if I were to clip all this hair, you'd see that the hoof wall ends here in this line. And right now, currently, the hoof, the wall here at the level of the ground has widened here. So if I draw this line, we've got the green line here. What we really want to see is this angle. So again, we want the yellow and the blue lines to be parallel. not this kind of diverging angle here. So when we're trimming, we really need to focus on looking from the side, keeping this in mind. And then, of course, we can always overdo it too much. So if we were to cut too much, the bone and the sensitive tissues underlying here will bleed. So that's what we call quicking, or just like a dog or a cat, when we clip nails and we get blood, that's the same will happen here if we are too aggressive with taking this off. So that's kind of when I'm teaching hoof trimming to folks that haven't done it before, this is the first piece, is keeping our angles in mind from the side. And the second is, what do we do with the bottom of the foot? So I think this one is a little bit easier to understand, but when you pick it up, the hooves primarily grow the wall. So you can see that our heels here they're a little overgrown in this drawing or this cartoon, but mostly it's the the wall of the toe that's overgrown. So the first thing I'll do is I'll take the tip of my nippers and I'm going to dig out all the dirt there. And then I'm going to try to bring this wall down so that it's flush with the sole. Also keeping in mind, so this graphic up here is the foot upside down. So we're going to trim a lot of this part of the toe here, and that both corrects the angle and takes away this excess here. And I have a demo to show you how to do that. So this is a picture, this is a 2-year-old doe with quite a bit of overgrown hoof. Small ruminants, like I said, they primarily grow hoof wall. This is the heel back here. And we have some extra growth there, but you can see how excessive the hoof wall is. And what they tend to do is this gets long and then it folds under the hoof. So they end up bearing weight on that. This allows for dirt and debris to get trapped under there, and eventually it creates inflammation. Here is that same hoof trimmed up. So this outside claw actually looks pretty good. So you can see that we've leveled the entire thing. We have a nice white line here. Everything is looking quite nice. This toe over here, we're going to talk about this. This is Whiteline disease. So because this has gotten excessively long, we've gotten dirt and debris packed in here, and that dirt has kind of wedged itself in between the sensitive and insensitive part of the hoof. We've got this pocket. And so we'll talk about how we deal with that. Okay, so I have just a single slide on the 2 most common foot diseases we see here in Minnesota, at least Dr. Knauer and I, when we're going out in the field looking at sheep and goats. So the first one is well known, it's foot rot. So as a review, this is an extreme case of foot rot in a sheep. So this is an infectious bacterial disease. It's caused by, it's a combination of 2 different bacteria, and you need both in order to get this. It's infectious. It happens basically from the environment, and then the property gets contaminated and it gets spread from animal to animal. Things that make this worse and help it spread faster are cold, wet conditions, mud and manure, and then anything that's causing kind of physical trauma to the hoof. So here in Minnesota, everybody knows, like in the spring, we get these freeze-thaw patterns. So it'll thaw a little bit, we'll get mud and these just kind of like horrible rocky parts of the pasture, and then that will freeze over, and the poor sheep and goats are walking on that and traumatizing their feet. So this whole process starts with some sort of initial irritation or trauma in between the toes. So we call that the interdigital space, and that's where all of this starts, is in between the toes. And then as it progresses, you can see things like lameness, reduced weight gain, decreased milk or wool production. These animals will have a harder time reproducing. And the way we treat it is hoof trimming. So hoof trimming is important with biosecurity, so keeping all of our equipment clean. But then they also will need some sort of topical treatment, so a foot bath to help get rid of the bacteria. And then sometimes we even need systemic antibiotics. So foot rot is something we can exacerbate by not keeping up on our hoof trimming. There is a scoring system. I just put a couple of examples here. It's a score that was developed. It's a scale of 0 to 5. And so this is a picture of a 0. So this is a perfectly normal interdigital space. So here's the toe, here's the heel. And if you spread this animal's toes apart, you can see the space in between is beautiful. It's just cute. It has little pink skin underneath and nice haired area. This here is a score of 1. So we spread the toes, and I hope you can appreciate that there's a little bit of discharge. You can see it's a little bit kind of tannish yellow in between here. So this is the very beginning of foot rot in this interdigital space. This is a score of 3. So we've got a much bigger wound lesion here. We've got hair loss up kind of up above at the level of the coronary band, and really a deep crevice oozing. This is probably very painful if you were to touch this. Hopefully you'd put gloves on and touch it, but who knows. This is as bad as it gets. So this is a score of 5. So what's happened now is this disease has spread from the interdigital space in between the toes and has really kind of infiltrated the sole and most of the hoof here. So that is foot rot. And then the other disease we see a lot is Whiteline disease. This is more of a mechanical issue. I will say it can predispose to infections or abscesses. It can set up shop for that, but by itself, it's more of a mechanical problem. So this, like I talked about, this white line is separation of the junction of the soft and the hard part, or the sensitive and insensitive parts of the hoof. And it occurs kind of secondary to infrequent trimming. So if we're not trimming enough, and then also like small physical traumas. So if we're getting small cracks or defects kind of at this white line area, or physical damage to the wall. So think about that frozen pasture, like the rocky frozen pasture in the spring kind of thing. So the way we deal with this actually is we trim all of this away. So this is upside down. So this is the bottom and this is the top of the hoof. We would actually take our nippers and start trimming this hoof wall up until we found a place where it really still, it met back up with it looked more attached to the actual hoof itself. And then that gives that a chance to dry out. We would try to get rid of any debris that was packed in there, clean it out as best we can, and then give it some time to grow down. For the most part, I feel like trimming is curative for this disease. I will say if it goes on long enough, this can, certainly if you were to pack dirt and mud in here, that could become a hoof abscess. So those are the 2 most common things we see. So I just wanted to drive my point home here about how we trim. So I have, let's just see if this will work. One moment here. So we have some gracious donors that were willing to donate some of their animals to us for learning. And we try to make the most of those. So I have a couple of feet to share with you tonight, and I just was going to quickly trim one of them so I could kind of talk you through how I approach this. Could someone just, Knauer, could you confirm that you can see the camera?
Yeah,
you can see the footy.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to come over here and put some gloves on. Okay. So I'm actually going to set this foot aside over here. So we're going to work on this foot here. So, and I'll just see if the camera, it might just take a moment to adjust here or check with the light. So the first thing I guess I want to point out are our angles. So you can see here where the hair meets the hoof, that's our coronary band. And this hoof isn't terribly overgrown, but I think if you were here with your protractor, you could see that this line is not parallel to this line. So we're starting to have some divergence here because this portion of the toe has grown out and leaves this behind. So what we'll need to do is focus on trimming kind of in this direction in order to restore those parallel lines. And then if I turn the foot over, what I hope you can see is, so we've got some dirt packed in here, but this is overgrown hoof wall, as is this over here. So it's grown out and then it's starting to fold under. So this is hoof wall. And then back here, this is the heels, and those are also starting to grow under. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually kind of start by showing you how I take the tip of my nippers and I dig out all the dirt first. Get it all over the classroom counter if you can. People really like that. So I think I've got that mostly dug out there. So what I would do, to be honest, first is if I'm trying to address that angle, I probably would come down here and, oh boy, thought I picked some new nippers. Ooh, now I know how the students feel. And I'm going to start by trying to address this angle first. So the way I do that is I'm going to take this front portion down and leave a bit of the sole at the back. So, sorry. In my head, this was really smooth and I looked really cool, but I didn't choose the sharpest nippers. So hopefully what you can see is here's the white line that's showing up. Well, let's see if I can. Oh, it's so bright. That's a little better. So this is white line here, and I'm starting to bring this back to be a bit more parallel. The heel, so when we're teaching students how to do this, we typically have them be very conservative on the heel. This is a very vascular and sensitive part of the foot. So when in doubt, I ask them to actually be less aggressive, but this heel is starting to roll in. So I am gonna trim it back to some degree because we want everything to be flush. And sorry guys, my nipper's so dull. So if this was a live foot, I am approaching, so this has got, the sole has gone from kind of a white to a little bit pink. So I am right near the quick. So that's probably as much as I can trim this sole here. So what I want to just show you is it's not perfect, but here's my pointer. So our angle is a little bit closer. I still have a little work to do here. So I could take this, oh my goodness, wall down a little bit, this heel as well. But we're trying to get these two lines to be a bit more parallel. I think we're getting there. This claw, I'm hoping this shows up on camera. There's a little bit of separation here. This is probably a little bit of Whiteline disease starting. So we got some separation of the wall. So the way Dr. Knauer and I deal with this is we just trim up until we get to an area where it's more solidly fixed to the hoof wall. So in this case, we don't need a whole lot for this foot. So and that's probably all I would do on this foot here. So just like your dogs and cats, their quicks grow with the foot. And so sometimes we can't get this all done in one session, right? We don't want to take too much. We don't want them to bleed. We don't want to open up areas that could get infected. So we don't always do this in one session. So if you have a foot that's really overgrown, you may need to come back to it in a couple of weeks and have another look. So, and I'm just trying to see if I can show you. So this is kind of how those two toes compare now from the top down. Okay, let's just take a look at this other claw. This one was not very overgrown, this little hoof here. We've got a little bit of the heel up here that's growing out, so I can trim this, get some of this out of here. But this is a pretty well trimmed hoof already. And again, I'm just trying to get these two lines parallel. So, oops. This is the coronary band angle. This is the hoof angle. We want them to be pretty parallel. Okay, so let me. All right, so with that, I'm going to let Dr. Knauer wrap up, and then we are happy to take some questions.
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Barrell. Oh, started my video and then it went away. There we go. Yes. So our summary slide. So again, this is just kind of the bullet point overview of kind of what we talked about. So again, pre-breeding, what do we want to do? So we want to think about health, considering proper nutrition, how do we monitor nutrition, body condition scoring, vaccination. So a really important consideration to start thinking about. I saw some great discussion in the chat about the CD&T vaccine. And we do really recommend that the clostridial diseases in particular, very important for all classes of animals, even pets. So we do consider that as the most important vaccine to get into your small ruminants. Thinking about deworming and targeting that deworming pre-breeding. That's gonna take energy away from your ewes and your rams and your does and your bucks. And then making those culling decisions or decisions not to breed. We don't have to cull everything, but there might be some animals in the herd or the flock that we aren't going to breed this year for different reasons. Consider doing breeding soundness exams. So breeding soundness exams are really important when we're considering who to use, what ram or what buck to use in our herd or our flock. And it can really improve our reproductive performance, profitability. And then biosecurity. So this is the time of year when we're potentially bringing new additions in. So thinking through kind of what is the risk tolerance that you have, and then thinking through those things of, considering a quarantine area, testing new additions, how are you going to introduce those animals to the herd or the flock, and then of course, hoof trimming. So Dr. Barrell gave us some really great information and a great demo to kind of hit home what the basic principles are for hoof trimming, and then she discussed those two big diseases that we see, Footrot and Whiteline Disease. So with that, we were happy to take any questions that haven't been answered.
Okay, thank you to my talented colleagues. And so we're going to dig through some of these questions. Our individuals have sent a whole bunch of great ones. I think in terms of just as we look at it from a topic standpoint, let's just stay on some of the hoof kind of health as well. And so one of those is I'm going to start at the top there. Have you used the trimmers that run off of an air compressor?
So I haven't personally. For our purposes here, the volumes that we're doing don't necessitate pneumatic, but I don't know if Dr. Knauer has any different experience than me.
No, I don't. I think the risk in using some of those more mechanical versions is that you can over trim. But certainly people for sure use them.
Yes, ladies, and I've seen it done. I mean, to me, those that are trained to do it and can do it well can obviously do it more efficiently than any of us with sharp tools or unsharp tools. But obviously, if it's in front of you, it's coming off, right? And so you got to be careful, particularly when I would describe that as the angles. So the angles that Dr. Barrell showed, particular of whether you're working at the back of the foot or the front of the hoof, there is you got to make sure that you're right, or you're going to provide some times in that sheep and or goat's life where, the hoof will grow back. I mean, we know that, but there's going to be a time where it's going to be sore and or a problem in terms of mobility, right? And so if it works for people, that's good, but I guess I wouldn't put my most novice people there, or we don't want the learning curve to be very, very long, right? So.
For sure. We see them used in professional settings a lot. So here in the Midwest, we know of some operations that's all they do is they professionally trim small ruminant herds.
Yep.
They have the equipment, they come in, we're talking thousands and thousands of goats and sheep. So I think in that case, yeah, you probably don't want to be using your handheld nippers for 10,000 head of goats.
Can you discuss a little bit more about foot baths and what we would do if that has an importance?
Yeah, so foot baths are basically a topical way to, I'll say, disinfect. They are used and there are a variety of different things that we can put in them. So copper sulfate, some places still use formalin. Zinc is another type of foot bath. So there are a couple of different substances out there, and what you use depends on your species, right? So sheep in particular are supremely sensitive to copper, so using copper foot baths is maybe not our best decision. Typically working with your veterinarian to decide if you need a foot bath is great. The thing about foot baths is they require a certain amount of time and exposure. So what we're talking about is finding a way that a sheep has to walk through it and stand in it, or a goat, for a certain period of time. So that comes into play. What comes into play there is facility design. So we need a way to run animals individually through an alleyway, have them stand in the foot bath for a prescribed amount of time, and then step out. Those baths have to get changed periodically and refreshed, and the frequency that you do this depends on if you're doing it for prevention or if you're having an active foot bath outbreak, an active foot rot outbreak. So I guess I would say this is something to work with your veterinarian about. And they're really useful, but you do have to have the correct facilities for it.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, very much so. So the advantage of our two talented ladies, both being a part of this, is you probably get to see some of these questions, so the brainstorming can at least get a head start. And so the question is, have you seen any studies showing a link between mineral deficiencies in your white line, as you talked about on your hoof health?
Let me jump in because we were able to see the questions. I was able to look it up and see if there are any studies, and the answer is no. So there is a link, or there is a proposed link in cattle between white line and mineral deficiencies or nutrition, but that same link doesn't seem to be so in sheep and goats, or it hasn't been really developed or kind of illuminated. So I would say that what Dr. Barrell was talking about with the predisposing factors and what kind of causes white line is what we currently understand for our sheep and goats.
I thought a good question about foot rot being cured, or should they be culled, since we're on the hoof kick here. So I think just like any disease, what's going to be important is keeping a record. So I think treating foot rot once probably is, fine. I think you're going to have animals that respond, they get trimmed, potentially they get a foot bath if you're using that, or they get treated sometimes with an antibiotic. And then they go on with their business and everything's fine. But you need to then write all of that down, because if you come back a month later, because you're trying to get rid of that in your herd and it's the same animal, over and over again, I think that animal should probably be culled. Just like any disease, it seems like there's individual variation in how long they're ill for, whether or not their immune system can clear it. So I guess I would say it's probably worth treating at least once. How many times you repeat the treatment after that is kind of based on your herd size and your goals, and how aggressively you want to get rid of whatever disease, to be honest, that you're dealing with.
All right, thank you, teammates. For those of you that have something that's more specific in terms of hoof trimming and management, feel free to reiterate that question, if you will. Otherwise, we're going to go to the broader picture. All right, we dug on a whole bunch of stuff, and particularly Dr. Knauer attacked a lot in terms of just whole herd and whole flock health management. I thought a question that's very nice to kind of lead this off, and was on the body condition scoring. Okay, and so the inquiry came at dairy ewes and or dairy goats. And so Whitney, when we see that slide, or when I see that slide, I think of beef cattle, and I also think of sheep as well. Or meat or production sheep, if that's the case, the ones that are at least derived for meat production, on how that top line and that spinous process is made and how that muscle is. And so what is there in terms of expectations, in your personal opinion, for dairy production ewes and dairy production goats when we look at body condition score?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So meat goats, same story as sheep. So they deposit fat very similarly. So meat goats, sheep, similar. We still body condition score dairy goats similarly. I think they definitely have less subcutaneous fat. But when you palpate over that dorsal spine and over those transverse processes, so those parts of the vertebrae, even in a dairy animal, you're still going to be able to, it might not be perfectly the same, but you're still going to be able to gauge skinny fat, right? So maybe you're not going to be able to be super specific and be able to give 0.5 point scores, for example, but it's still very similar. And there is actually one described body condition scoring system specifically for goats. It's just visual, and it's sort of from the top, and it's the same thing, where we're looking at kind of that subcutaneous deposition of fat kind of over that back space between the ribs and the hips, and then also kind of looking at fatty deposition over the hips. It is true that the goats, dairy goats in particular, tend to put a lot of fat in their omentum, so in their abdomen, as compared to kind of subcutaneously. But we still use the same sort of scale for our dairy goats.
Thank you very much. And so, obviously being able to determine where those are, and I think with some expertise, for all of our talented managers of sheep and or goats, particularly even those that are of dairy emphasis, is that being around those and looking at where home base is, and importantly, kind of monitoring that, and whether that you do that in the spring and or the fall or whatever that may be from a regular standpoint, then you'll realize if you're ahead, behind, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Okay. And so appreciate all of that. We've got a great question, is on scrotal circumference. Okay. And so how do we evaluate scrotal circumference? And I think we kind of got to that with the measurements, and then also tried to put some of the summation in here that mature rams should be hopefully upwards of 34 centimeters, goats at 25 centimeters. But big picture, Dr. Knauer, we've got a ram and or buck, and we say that we're going to look at a scrotal circumference and look at semen sample evaluation costs as well. Can you dig into that for a second?
Sure. Was that a question?
Oh, sorry. Maybe I answered them all. See, right?
I think you kind of did.
There you go. Nailed it. At least it was in the chat box, right?
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think so. So the point being that there are guidelines for sheep and goats, and they are published by the veterinary reproduction experts, and those scrotal circumferences correlate to performance. So that and there's the mature ram, and then there's also a ram lamb. I think it's 30 centimeters. And so they can still be satisfactory while not actually having that bigger circumference. So and I saw there was also a question about when can we use a ram lamb, or what's the age? Yep. And I mean, so even with use, so I think it depends on your goals. I mean, the value of using a younger animal. So these animals are able to reproduce at 4 months of age. So that's when they sort of become sexually mature, and that's when we want to separate our males and our females, so we don't have those teenage pregnancies. But what some producers want to do is they want to wait till that first year, so that you're breeding animals kind of in their second year. The value in that is that they are bigger, but then they can also get fatter. And so there's kind of a trade-off there that you really need to pay attention to that. The most profitable way to think about breeding programs is breeding animals kind of in their first year. But again, it really depends on your goals as a producer. And then again, those ram lambs, if they pass their breeding soundness, they can be used in their first year. They're very able. Some people worry about size and like the size differential between a ram lamb and a mature ewe. The probably the biggest risk is if you put them in with mature rams, they're going to get the crap beat out of them. And so that's why you always, if you're not putting one out with 40, then you want 3 out so that 2 of them are always fighting, and then the other one is out there breeding. So that's kind of the risk in using a younger animal if you have them out there with multiple other rams. But really, they can get the job done if they pass their breeding soundness exam.
Thank you. From a biosecurity standpoint, and I think this is important as well. So the individual says, when your flock is closed, this relates to dairy goats, is it necessary to test every year? And first off, even when I think about it from a sheep standpoint, or when we think about it from a goat approach, one of those functions that can catch us a little bit harder, right, is OPP or the CAE, right? That can cause a little bit larger challenges for us. And so from a biosecurity standpoint, what do we envision that you would consider most appropriate to test for, and then kind of how can we move forward?
Dr. Barrell, do you want to take this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we talk about testing, we talk about the big 3. So Dr. Knauer mentioned Yonis, CAE or OPP, and CL. I think for CAE and OPP, we have a fantastic test here at the University of Minnesota that can detect positives down to like 6 months of age. A lot of the other labs in the country recommend waiting to test for those viruses until about a year. There is no consensus out there amongst how many negative tests you need in order to call an animal negative. So it's a good test here. I guess I would feel confident saying, if I had 2 negatives within maybe a 12-month period, I would feel pretty happy saying that animal is certainly negative. So the test, any test can be wrong. So a single negative, even in a strong test, sometimes if your goal is to be disease-free, that can be challenging. The problematic disease is Yonis. So Yonis in particular, animals become infected early in life, but it can take months, years more likely for their bodies to produce antibodies, meaning that they can have falsely negative tests for several years before they actually will convert to that. So Yonis is one where we recommend, if you want to be Yonis free, we test probably yearly. And there's no telling when you could get a positive. So that's a frustrating disease for every species. So that's the dairy industry, right, is where we see that mostly in cattle. And it's hard to find those subclinical animals that haven't yet, call it seroconverted, and started to make antibodies. So that disease can be a particular challenge to look for. CL you can test for anytime. CL is one of those obnoxious diseases that for the most part is annoying. Every once in a while we have a bad case that can cause life-threatening disease, but that can be tested for anytime. The test isn't perfect, so that one can be a bit harder to eradicate as well. So I guess my overall point is a closed herd, probably if your goal was to say sell animals and market them as disease-free, you would still need to test a minimum of 1 to 2 times in order to say these animals are negative. And then we have to, when you say closed, that means literally no new males in, nobody on or off the property, going to shows or anything like that. And I think that's hard. That's a hard bar to meet for a lot of producers. So I hope that helps. I'm happy to.
That was amazing. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Dr. Knauer, would you kind of talk about your thoughts on kind of our fecal egg count reduction tests and kind of how we can incorporate that as a whole operation management?
Yeah, so there was a question about that as it relates to new introduction. So I'll just address that piece because the rest of it could be a whole nother webinar. So we feel pretty strongly. So most of the time when resistant worms rear their ugly head on an operation, it's because they're bought in. And so we feel pretty strongly that animals that come into a herd or a flock that are going to go out into the population and go out on pasture and mingle with everyone else, we want them to have like 0 worms in their manure before they go out and become part of the herd or the flock. And so we feel strongly that that is part of kind of the new animal testing regime, that we add that fecal egg count reduction test. So again, that's where we take a sample, we do a fecal egg count, and then we deworm that animal. And that's when we would actually recommend using multi-class dewormers. So we would use 2 or 3 in combination, rather than just one product. And that's, again, a whole nother sort of topic that we would do on the individual animal that is coming out to the herd or the flock, with the idea that we are going to wipe out all the worms in that animal before they go. And so we expect a fecal egg count reduction of 100%. And that's what we would want before that animal is going to be introduced. So that is how we would kind of incorporate that into a biosecurity plan.
Okay, thank you. I am going to talk just a smidge on here. And so just from a summary standpoint, I appreciate everybody that has passed in some tremendous questions in terms of thought process. But, I've got to, again, we're on a Tuesday evening for those of you who are joining us live. And for those of you that aren't joining us, it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? Okay, so it's one of those. But, I think we went the whole gamut of talking, kind of ensuring health for rams and our bucks and our ewes, all right? And we talked about breeding soundness exams, biosecurity, and then of course you got the hoof trimming evaluation as well. I will tell those that get to watch this at a later point in time that we do have a poll. And for my talented colleagues, and this is why I get excited to have great colleagues, is that we went 100% that we met the expectations, and 100% that they found this information useful. And so, again, it's great to be surrounded by talented people. And in fact, here at the University of Minnesota, and again, we have a extension sheep and goat team that kind of work to provide some together. And this is why we have Dr. Knauer and Dr. Barrell, is because they get the chance to help to train our veterinary professionals at the University of Minnesota, so that when they do make it out into our industry, that they are competent in sheep and goats and alpacas and all things animals. So thanks so much for your guys' portion of being part of our projects. One of the things is that as we look at it from August, a couple of the topics that we will evaluate as we move through the fall is that we will talk about kind of the impact of wool, particularly in our Minnesota economy, but then also just kind of how that relates to our operations. And then we will do some interactive and virtual sheep and goat tours. And then before we know it, ladies, we are back to kidding and lambing, and we're rocking on. So the world that is, as we think about it, and that's why pre-breeding management is so important here. If we're at August 8, we're kind of climbing the ladder to a turn of the year, calendar year, at January, kidding and lambing. And so it's real. All right. And so it's get those things done from a CD&T and management and body condition score. And we still have just a little bit of time to try to get those ewes and does to the right spot and make sure that our rams and bucks are producing semen, and that can help to get those bred. So again, thanks so much to our talented ladies that have helped put this on. Thanks to Brenda Miller, that's also helped on our team here in our sheep and goat group. And so look forward to everybody joining us, and again, being part of our sheep and goat industry. So thanks, Emily, Dr. Emily Barrell, Dr. Whitney Knauer, and we are driven to discover to the University of Minnesota Extension Sheep and Goat team. Live the dream. Thanks.